Okay, thank you so much. Um, this was so insightful, and I obviously it was so relatable because everyone loves magic. Everyone knows of magic tricks. We've seen them from the simple things like the ball, from the card games, and then even more complicated ones. What I learned from this was that everything is all based on the brain, and I loved how you broke that down and explained that kind of like the faster a person moves with the sleight of hand and using distractions, that it can confuse and overwhelm the brain. So during that small little study that you did with Jeff Goldblum, I was wondering, what was the most kind of surprising thing to learn about just the brain itself? For Stephen?
Oh, so I would say that the most important thing that we learned from studying Jeff was that where he's looking is where he is tending to pay attention. And Susana, jump in here anytime if you have any other things to add. But where you pay attention and where you look aren't necessarily the same place. And you can only actually process consciously those places you're paying attention. And what's interesting about human beings is we can only see well in the very center of our vision. So if we pay attention in the periphery, we're actually paying attention to somewhere where we're blind. And so one of the things that magicians can do is get us to pay attention where we're literally, have lower than 20/20 vision. And that's the only thing we can see. And then where we actually have 20/20 vision, we're not paying attention, so we miss what's going on.
So you can be looking at something, but that doesn't mean that you're seeing it if you're not paying attention.
So what I was also wondering with this whole study, just in general, is there a way to trick the brain so that we can see more than what we would just normally would pay attention to, for both of you?
No, we wouldn't want to. So first off, the short answer is no. Okay. This is intrinsic of our neural wiring. We're hardwired to only pay attention to a very small portion of reality. But if that was not the case, it would be impossible to do science or art or anything that required focusing on something. So this is actually, it's not a bug, it's a feature that we're built on this.
Is there a way that we can kind of strengthen the brain either with these exercises? And if so, what does that do for the brain itself? For both of you, Stephen?
Well, it's interesting because education itself is basically kind of exercise for your mind, and you learn how to focus on things for longer and longer periods as you go higher up in the academic ladder. And so one of our great mentors, James Randi, the amazing Randi, he taught us that some of the people that are easiest to fool have a PhD after their name. And what he meant by that is that the PhDs have learned to pay attention really hard to something. And so a magician can get them to pay attention to something over here. And while they're doing that, they can't see even more than people who have less education something over here, just because they've learned to concentrate so hard on things that they can pay attention for a long time and they miss what's happening over here. So it seems like practicing in education actually makes you focus for longer, and that's what the power of education is. But that also means that you actually you lower the noise level and other things, and that's what magicians can take advantage of.
What I would add to that is that it's pretty hopeless to try and train yourself to multitask. What you want to do is to make it easier for your brain to single task. What does that mean? That means to eliminate distractions. So if now in the era that we live and we're constantly interrupted by alarms from our social media and emails and notifications of all types, that is very hard for our brain to function with that constant interruption, because what that forces us to do is task switching. And we're notoriously bad at that, because every time that we switch our attention, we lose time and it makes it harder to focus. So multitasking is not the answer. It's more efficient single tasking.
So I know it also in the show there was a part about when we're children, how we all want to just look at everything and pay attention. What's that? What does that mean? Can you talk about the differences in the brains, say from children to adults, and what is it that we lose over time that we probably wouldn't known? Sorry, Stephen.
Yeah. So when you're a child, you haven't actually learned how to pay attention very well yet. And that's what's happening. That's why they see all this stuff happening all the time, is because they can't focus in on anything for any long period of time. They haven't exercised the attention parts of their brain to do that enough yet to be able to do that. And so that's really what that is. And so by learning and becoming expert in things and by growing up, we learn how to focus in on things. And this is what the attentional mechanism that is different between children and adults. It's very hard for magicians to practice magic, the same kind of magic they do for adults, they can't do for very young children, just because children will actually see some of the methods better than adults will, because they will not pay attention where they're supposed to, or where the magician wants them to, in order for the magician to get away with magical murder over here, right? So that's the real trick there. So children's magicians have different kinds of tricks.
And a couple of other things that are different between children and adults is, for one, children are much more plastic in terms of their brain. It is easier for children to learn. That's why children can learn a second language much more easily than adults do. The other thing that children don't have that adults do is, and this is both an advantage and a disadvantage in terms of magic, but what children don't have is very rigid expectations about the way that the world works. And when our own children were younger, they thought that the kind of faucets where you put your hand underneath and water comes out, they thought that was magic. So they don't have such rigid notions of what's magical versus not, what's possible according to the laws of physics. And so they're going to be surprised more or less depending on these expectations or lack of expectations. Whereas as adults, we are more rigid in our thinking because we have more life experience. And that makes us more susceptible to being fooled in some ways, but in other ways, we can be more efficient in the way that we process information.
Would that also apply to, say, a brain who is aging, maybe a bit more on the dementia side or disease side? With that, does it kind of revert back to when it's like the childlike, when you can't focus on anything? Have you seen a difference between the two?
It's not something that we have studied. People whose brains, in this, in the sense of magic, our magic research has not. We haven't applied it to people who may be suffering from neurological impairment. We have studied neurological populations in some other of our work, but not in terms of magic. Having said that, I wouldn't say that the aging brain is a brain that reverts back to a childlike state. I would say that this is different because even though if perhaps processing speed is not as much as it used to be and the ability to focus maybe is lower, that wouldn't necessarily mean that you have now no weight from expectations, from life experience. That's still going to be with you even if you're not functioning at the top in terms of cognitive performance.
When you grow up and when you become more expert at things, the process seems to in part be pruning away things that you don't use. Okay, so as you grow older, one of the ways you become more expert is you can't do things that would otherwise take your attention. Those parts of your brain are gone. You use it or you lose it. And when you become demented, unfortunately, even some of the things that you use, you start to become less good at. So you've lost things throughout the course of becoming expert and efficient, but at the same time now, as you become aging, you just get less good at the things you know how to do as well. So it's not like reverting back to being a child and just seeing everything with childlike eyes.
Were there any misconceptions that you both originally had before this study?
That's a good question.
I guess before we started to study magic, we hadn't really thought much about it. So I wouldn't say there was a misconception. It was more like lack of knowledge. We had not realized, for instance, that there's such an overlap between the kinds of things that magicians are interested in and the things that we are interested in as scientists. And the other thing that I would mention that not perhaps a misconception, but a lack of appreciation that would be true both of us and of the public in general, is that magicians make it seem very easy. And that's part of the art. But something that looks effortless on stage, it may have a lot of thinking behind. It may have weeks or months of practice, and that's it's a bit tragic in a way, because you don't really get to appreciate the hard work that that magic has behind us, as you might perhaps with beautiful sculpture, where you can see that the sculpture must have taken a lot of work to make it look in a certain way.
Yeah.
But 1 minute left.
Okay.
Yeah, go ahead, please. Proceed, Stephen.
Is it okay?
Did you want to ask a last question?
Oh, yes. The last question that I have is really quick. What exercises that you can recommend for people who are afraid to, if you don't use it, you lose it?
Well, first, physical exercise. So being fit, we know that physical fitness is good for brain fitness. So since we only have 1 minute to answer, I would say that just improve your physical health and keep active, keep learning things, and that reinforcing those connections.
Okay. Thank you so much. This was fun. Thank you.
Yeah.
Thank you, Dana.